Meeting of the State's Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel. So first order of business is to call the roll, the attendance. So why don't we start at the end of the table, the dais with Mr. Dave Noyes, and move in this direction.
Dave Noyes, Compliance Manager for HDI at Pilgrim.
John Moylan, Holtec, Site Vice President.
Kelly O'Brien, representing Local 369.
Mary Gatzlick, appointed by the Senate Minority Leader.
John Mahoney, Plymouth Select Board Delegate.
Mary Lampert, appointed by the Senate President.
Andrew Gottlieb, appointed by Governor Baker.
Jack Priest, appointed by the Commissioner of the Department of Public Health.
Seth Pickering, appointed by the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs, Mass DEP.
Henrietta Cosentino, appointed by the Select Board of Plymouth.
We have, I believe we have a couple of people zooming in who are members of the committee. How about Ms. Dubois?
Pine Dubois, appointed by the Speaker of the House some time ago.
I also see Mr. Nichols up there.
Yep, Dave Nichols, appointed by Governor Baker. I'm on my way. I'm just stuck in traffic.
Oh, that's great, Dave. Thank you. Be safe. And is that Mary Waldron, upper left corner?
Yep. Good evening, everyone. My apologies for not being there in person. Executive Director of the Old Colony Planning Council.
Is there anybody else I missed who's zooming in remotely as a member of the panel? Okay. We're also, so I want to welcome Andrew, first meeting, so congratulations. We're also working on an appointment. Mr. Mike Fortini is out there in the second row, working with apparently one of the 3 Republican state senators in Massachusetts to get him the appointee, be appointed for the Senate minority slot on the committee. So we're working diligently on that. Anyone else? There's no one else here, so it's a member of the panel. Okay, I'd like to move on to the next agenda item, which is the previous minutes approval. I believe there was some leftover business from July, and then we had September to look at. So, Mary, did we ever solve the issues with the July minutes?
Well, as I explained to Dave, that my memory is not up to the standards of my personality. So I did send the Southeastern Massachusetts Health Study to him, and some other materials and studies that were done going back to the early 70s. And I also sent it to members of the panel. However, some members could not accept such a large download, so I will try to split it up in little pieces and send it to them.
Okay, so I saw a flurry of activity with respect to emails in the last few hours. One of those, I saw the health study. I obviously can't imagine anyone's had a chance to take a look at it. So is this something that you want to table and bring up at the next meeting?
No, it was Dave Noyes who wanted to table it, correct?
I didn't have any concern for the study. I'm familiar with the study. My concern was that we were going to add things to the minutes without reading what they said. Now I understand what they say, and I'm fine with what they say, with one change that I forwarded earlier tonight, where it said Mrs. Lambert corrected Mr. Noyes. She did not correct Mr. Noyes. She disagreed with Mr. Noyes.
Mary, you okay with that correction?
Yes, I am. But I hope you all enjoy reading the reports.
Okay, so we can now move on the July meeting minutes?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Okay. So is there a motion to approve the July meeting minutes with the noted correction?
I so move.
Henrietta, motion, second? Mary? Any further comment on the meeting minutes from July? All right, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor?
Aye.
All right, those against? Any abstentions?
Yes.
2 abstentions, Mr. Lambert and Mr. Gottlieb. Okay, now on to the September meeting minutes. So does anybody have any other concerns about Henrietta?
This is just a small change, but on page 4 of the September minutes, I am quoted where it says, the very last paragraph, Ms. Cosentino would like noted for the record that she, along with Mrs. Lampert, wants time at NDCAP to be spent on legal issues surrounding discharge. She believes that the time spent on a presentation on tritium is irreverent. That's what it says. That's not what I said. I rather like that typo because I think that the very idea of putting tritium in the bay is irreverent by inherently. However, what I actually said was irrelevant.
Okay, so you want a correction to that one word?
Yes. It is an entirely different word, right?
Correct, I agree.
Thank you.
Any other concerns on the meeting minutes from September? Is there a motion to approve with the one change noted by Ms. Constantino?
I move to approve.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Pine?
I sent a bunch of changes to you and Ms. Gadslick tonight. I just wanted to add to the people in attendees, guests in attendance, Bruce Watson, Neil Sheehan, ERM, Matt Daly, and John Drabinski, and that there were 61 public attendees virtually with 156 in person. That was substantially it. There were a couple of things that, just edit-wise, but I would like those to be, included as we send them back to the state for filing. And I did want one clarification that I believe is on page 6. It says leaching pits, I think Dave Noyes was talking, it says leaching pits have been removed in accordance with the MSA. Is that ESA, or am I not remembering what MSA means?
The document is the state agreement between the Attorney General, Holtec, and HDI. So I'm not sure whether there's an actual acronym for it, but it is the state agreement.
Mass settlement
Yes.
agreement?
Mass
Settlement agreement. Okay, great,
MSA.
great. That clarifies it, and I'll correct my understanding of that. And then Dave Noyes did have a bunch of additions that I thought were great. Just clarifications in terms of, as Henrietta was pointing out, words and, details. I think one in particular, historical data or provide live time rather than whatever else it was, which I already corrected, so I can't tell you what it was. That's it. There was nothing else substantial. Thank you.
John.
Henrietta?
Yeah. There was one other thing I noted. I don't know what it needs in the way of correction because I'm not quite sure what it means. It's the very last section, public comments and questions. It says, Barry, a member of the public. Is this supposed to be Dr. Barry Potvin?
I believe he got up to the microphone and spoke.
Yes. I would appreciate, I'm sure he would appreciate too, having his full name, as everybody else's name is there. So Dr. Barry Potvin, a member of the public, that's at the very beginning of the last section titled Public Comments and Questions. And he's not merely a member of the public, I'd like to point out. He is the chair of the Plymouth Board of Health. It should be so noted.
Duly noted, thank you.
Yes, I
Mary?
was going to mention the same thing. On the video, 1 minute, 42 seconds, I put in what he had to say. There is a danger of ingested/inhaled tritium. It is a beta, and it causes damage to the DNA, mutations, cancer. It can last one suggested for 40 years about. It can't be removed. We need to know what's in the water now. I think that provides a good balance to what Dr. Conca had to say, and particularly being chair of the Plymouth Board of Health. So, that's great.
Okay, so, does anyone want to make a motion to approve those meeting minutes?
I'm sorry, I'm
Go ahead,
very sorry,
Pine.
Chair. Down below that, it says Dr. Benjamin Cronin. There's a Dr. Barry and a Dr. Benjamin both talking at the same time? Or are they the same person?
No.
Anything else, Pine?
No, I would like to know if they're the same person.
No.
Thanks.
Yes. Stand up, both of you.
Any other suggested changes to the meeting minutes from September? Is there a motion to approve with all the changes that were suggested?
I move we approve them.
I second.
I didn't get the second. Does that come? Somebody said something. Who was? Mary Waldron. No, Mary Waldron. Sorry. Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Any other comments on the meeting minutes from September? All right, all those in approval? Anyone against approving the minutes? We have one. Mary? Any abstentions? 2 abstentions. Thank you. On to public comment. So first of all, with respect to public comment, is there a Mike Hugo who is requested via email to comment through Zoom? Is there anybody in there approaching that name?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, let him talk. Michael?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear. Just please introduce yourself and try to keep it to 3 minutes or less.
Okay, my name is Michael Hugo. I am the Director of Policy and the Director of Government Affairs for the Massachusetts Association of Health Boards, regardless of what my picture looks like there. I really do have a real job. I'm here to talk to you very quickly about the options that are available for the Plymouth Board of Health. I want to just start out by saying that I speak very frequently with Dr. Potvin, many times a week, most of it about this. There are some options available under the Massachusetts general laws. There is a statute that allows boards of health to intercede where they see what's called a public health nuisance occurring. A public health nuisance is anything, interpreted by Massachusetts courts, is anything that is of danger to the public health of the people living in the town of Plymouth. And the statutes empower the Board of Health to stop all nuisances and to remove the causes of nuisances. In this case, what I'm going to be recommending to the board, and they hopefully will take to your town council and to your town manager, who is very experienced in public health, is a recommendation that we put together a moratorium by the Board of Health, which citing the general laws on nuisance and on something called noisome trade, which is where a business commits basically a trespass on everybody around it for certain noxious activities, such as dumping radioactive waste into a bay. So I just want to let you know that the Mass Association of Health Boards is working with your Board of Health and will be reaching out to your town council so that we don't step on any toes, but we do plan on taking certain actions to protect the bay from a public health standpoint. And I think that Dr. Potvin, who is in the room, if he wants to have the rest of my time, I would yield that to him, unless you have any questions.
No, your comments are well taken, Michael. We appreciate you coming in tonight. Is there anyone here in the room that wants to get up on the public comment? Art, go ahead, thank you.
Good evening. Mr. Chairman, honorable committee members, members of the community, thank you for coming, participating in this very important issue. My name is Art Disloges, and I am on the executive committee of the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club is the oldest and largest grassroots organization in the United States dedicated to protecting our environment. I'm also a resident of Plymouth. Tonight, you will hear the deep concerns of citizens about this dump. I will not preview them. Rather, I will reinforce that the Sierra Club's mission is to not only protect the Earth's resources, but to stand up for environmental justice. The issue before us and you is who gets to decide whether Holtec International can dump this water into Cape Cod Bay. Is it Holtec based on their judgment on what is safe? Or is it the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, in accordance with the laws of Massachusetts and the required permitting process? As important, what role does this panel have in weighing in on this decision? I ask you that you consider this critical question and obtain unbiased expert testimony. Testimony on whether, in this particular case, a new permit is required. More precisely, does any amount of pollutants in the water necessitate a modified permit? Or is it okay to have a small amount? Who decides? Holtec or the state of Massachusetts? And I ask you to inform us citizens who you should believe should make this decision. Thank you.
Any, sir? No, yes.
Good evening. I brought some documents to leave with the committee tonight.
Sorry, go ahead.
That's all right. I was here a couple of months ago. My name is Chris Nord, and O-R-D is my last name, and I live up in Amesbury. I'm speaking here tonight on behalf of the Citizens Awareness Network, which is a New England-wide organization that has worked over the years to try to prevent harm to the general public from nuclear facilities of various kinds. I have 3 documents I wanted to leave with the committee. One of them I'm sure that you already know all about. I think it was mentioned earlier, the Southeastern Massachusetts Health Study. There is a part in there that I would love to read, but mostly I want to say that the Citizens Awareness Network 30 years ago was founded because there were victims in the Deerfield River Valley in western Massachusetts. There were mothers and families who had children who had Down syndrome and had birth defects and had terrible things happening in their families, enough so that they got together to say what's wrong. And they discovered that the Yankee Atomic Plant at Roe had been dumping radioactive water into the Deerfield River and emitting into the Deerfield River Valley since it had opened. And it was through the work in part of this organization, CAN, Citizens Awareness Network, that Yankee Row was eventually, the problems were brought to light and Yankee Row was closed. So I wanted to just read a little tiny bit from that study. Hopefully I can pull it out. Where is it here? Page 4, I think. Oh, not going to find it. I can tell you what the effects were. I'm missing my my notes. They're in front of me here somewhere. I'm sorry. My apologies. Did I leave them? Oh, here they are. Okay. Okay. So, there was statistical significance for breast cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, Down syndrome, tenfold increase, as well as elevated rates of immune deficiency diseases, birth defects, and learning disabilities. All of that is contained in this study. Subsequent to the closure of Yankee Atomic at Roe, cases of Down syndrome dropped. Now, that is not necessarily going to be the case with cancers because, as we know, the latency period of cancers are very different for the different forms of radiation and where it affects the body, and everybody is different. So cancers haven't changed as dramatically as something like Down syndrome, but they did see that go down. So following the discovery of how much radioactive water was being dumped into the Deerfield River, the Citizens Awareness Network undertook to do a study of tritium. This study is compiled by the Citizens Awareness Network, but it is not based on studies from the Citizens Awareness Network. It's based on the studies of scientists from all over the world. So I just want to read one passage here. Tritium is carcinogenic, mutagenic, and teratogenic. Human beings can receive chronic exposure through the ingestion of plants or animals exposed in an effluent pathway, in addition to direct uptake through inhalation, absorption, and drinking contaminated water. Especially sensitive to the effects of tritium are rapidly growing cells, such as fetal tissue, genetic materials, and blood-forming organs. So tritium is actually a beast, and tritium is a beast to childbearing women and their offspring. It's a beast to fetuses, and it's a beast to young children. All of those humans that have rapidly dividing cells. I have a copy of this study, and and I'm going to make it available to you, and I hope you all will look at it. As I said, it's not written by organizers, it's compiled by organizers with all of the background provided. It's thoroughly annotated, so you'll know whose study you're looking at. So my comments are just this. That document was from 1994, which means it's almost 30 years ago. Like a bad tooth, the news with radiation does not get better over time, it only gets worse. And that is actually a fact. 50 years of the National Academies of Science reports on the biological effects of radiation. Now there is a no harm threshold. The threshold has gone down. It was much higher before. Beer 7, the most recent report of the biological effects of ionizing radiation, finally stated that there is no threshold below which radiation is not harmful. Now that doesn't mean that radiation that was produced earlier was less harmful. That means that we finally figured out how harmful it actually is. And that means that the conclusions to studies that were done 30 years ago need to be revisited because actually there may be more harm resulting from low doses of radiation, for instance, than we thought previously because our understanding of how radiation works has changed. So what's so bad about low-level radiation? Low-level radiation has been found to be more efficient per dose at causing cellular damage. based in part on the research of a Canadian researcher named Abram Petkow, and you can check him out. As it accumulates, tritium, and it accumulates,
Chris?
excuse me.
Chris, you're at 6 minutes. How much time you need?
I've got 2 more paragraphs.
Okay, thank you.
willing?
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. Tritium exposure causes chemical changes that allow damaged living cells to attach to DNA. So damaged living cells means we're putting mutations into DNA. Releasing irradiated water from Pilgrim is a corporate crime. There are statutes, EPA, Commonwealth of Massachusetts statutes, that Holtec apparently intends to violate so that you can pay the attendant fines as the cost of doing business. Who are more likely to suffer physical harm as a result of this cynical calculation? The answer is women of childbearing age and children because of their rapidly dividing cells. But don't forget old people with diminished immune systems. Having your own set of alternative facts with regard to tritium and other radionuclides will not alter the outcome for the damage to the web of life your actions would cause. This is why so many common people oppose what you intend.
We have to, so we're going to move on to the federal delegation
No.
is waiting. There's another section of public comment towards the end of the meeting.
No,
Very briefly, Jim.
It will be very brief. I just wanted to thank you and whoever else put together the agenda to provide for this short amount of comment at the beginning. I think you're right to provide, particularly given the fact that there are 2 months. What it provides, particularly given the fact that there are 2 months between the meetings, is a good bridge from what has happened before to what is going to be discussed on the agenda tonight. And I recommend that we continue the practice. I also recognize that we obviously have to limit the time that would be provided, but as a basic good idea, I applaud the chair for including it.
Here, here. John.
All right, so we're moving on. Henrietta, you can pick that up towards the end of the meeting, no problem. So we're moving on to the federal delegation. We have Mr. Jim Cantwell zooming in. He's representing Senator Ed Markey, and in the on-deck circle, we have Mike Jackman, who of course represents Congressman Keating. Mr. Cantwell, welcome.
Thank you, John, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all members of NDCAP for your important public service and your listening to all the citizens tonight. Thank you all the citizens present, presenting your comments or demonstrating your concerns. My name is Jim Cantwell. I'm the State Director for Senator Ed Markey, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Ben Thomas and Katie Moorfill, who work for Senator Markey, our close friends and partners, Mike Jackman, Congressman Keating's District Director, and Caleb White with Senator Warren's office are also attending the meeting. And I spoke earlier to Sue Moran, our great state senator, who I know is also present, and we appreciate her collegiality and her partnership. I understand that we have some new members of NDCAP. I'm going to be providing a brief statement on behalf of Senator Markey. When Holtec took over the Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station in 2019, it promised our community an open and transparent decommissioning process. But now, 3 years later, Holtec is leaving our communities in the dark regarding the potential discharge of 1 million gallons of radioactive water into Cape Cod Bay. The gentleman, by the way, from the Sierra Club earlier raised an important question regarding the requirement that Holtec follow tenets of the Clean Water Act. It's clear the Environmental Protection Agency has repeatedly stated that discharges of pollutants in water stored within the spent nuclear fuel pool, the dryer or separator pits, the torus or reactor cavity at this plant are not authorized by the current discharge permit, and that Holtec would need to obtain a permit modification to pursue a potential discharge. According to the EPA, nothing has changed on the need to obtain a permit modification since their letter of June 17th of this year. However, when Senator Warren, Congressman Keating, and I wrote to Holtec to confirm its compliance with the discharge permitting process, the company did not provide a clear answer on its plans to pursue a permit modification. This is troubling. Additionally, there are concerns raised by community stakeholders that a discharge into the bay could violate the Massachusetts Oceans Sanctuaries Act. Local residents and many businesses and organizations that rely on Cape Cod Bay's reputation for clean and safe water have real and understandable concerns about this potential discharge. They deserve to have a clear understanding of Holtec's plan and its commitment to follow relevant laws and regulations. Parenthetically, I understand we'll hear from others tonight testifying about what those laws and regulations are. A clear commitment from Holtec to adhere to its legal and regulatory requirements is especially pressing given a recent NRC inspection report that revealed that Holtec failed to implement a program of air sampling in a high radiation and high contamination area, exposing 6 contractors to unplanned exposure to airborne radioactivity. During the field hearing of the Senate Environment and Public Works Subcommittee on Clean Air, Climate, and Nuclear Safety at Plymouth Town Hall that Senator Markey chaired on May 6th, Dr. Singh, President and CEO of Holtec, promised that he would listen to relevant stakeholders and would not allow for a discharge of any water without the consent of our stakeholders. I am holding Dr. Singh to that commitment, says Senator Markey. My team and I are also working to ensure that Dr. Singh lives up to his commitment that Holtec will work with independent experts to analyze Pilgrim's spent fuel pool water and the potential impacts of any potential discharge of radioactive wastewater into Cape Cod Bay. As part of our efforts to ensure that transparency and collaboration, we have secured further commitments from Holtec that it would allow the Mass Department of Public Health, that is, to both be present for the sampling of Pilgrim's spent fuel pool water and allowed to conduct testing and analysis on split samples of the water. But the work is not finished there. Since the May 6th hearing, my office has been working diligently to identify a panel of experts to engage in an independent analysis of the water samples. My office, Senator Markey continues, is now working to facilitate a memorandum of understanding between Holtec and that panel to study the environmental and public health impacts of a release of effluent water into Cape Cod Bay. We look forward to continuing those conversations with NDCAP on this engagement between Holtec and the independent experts once John and all the members, once there is that signed agreement, we would be releasing who those independent folks are. In addition, recognizing great concerns about the economic impacts of any potential discharge, my office, working with our partners here tonight, Senator Warren, Congressman Keating, Senator Moran, we have identified and engaged universities to identify economic experts who can study the effects of a discharge on the Cape Cod Bay economy. We will share that potential detailed options with NDCAP for review soon. In conclusion, while Senator Markey says, while I'm working to provide clarity to our community, we continue to hear from constituents from Plymouth to Provincetown voicing their concerns about this proposed discharge. We must hold Holtec accountable to their commitment to listen to stakeholders, and we must protect against any unsafe release of this water. The public deserves to have a say in how Holtec's waste is disposed. We have 4 options. We keep pressing for other options to be reviewed in order to make sure that the public will be fully informed about both the contents of that waste and potential impacts of its disposal. Senator Markey says, I look forward to continuing to work with Holtec, NDCAP, and all of our local stakeholders to ensure that there is no unsafe discharge of any radioactive water into Cape Cod Bay. Thank you very much.
Mike, you next?
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to my colleague Jim Cantwell and to Senator Martin's staff, and Senator Warren and her staff as well for all the work they've been doing on this issue. I have a brief statement from Congressman Keating, who unfortunately could not be with us tonight. Thank you for the opportunity to share this brief statement. I remain committed in my opposition to the potential discharge of effluent from the decommissioned plant into the waters of Cape Cod Bay, and I urge Holtec to reconsider this misguided plan. My staff and I have worked with federal and state agencies, including the NRC and EPA, to ensure that every regulatory avenue being explored to protect this vital natural resource. I am encouraged by discussions with the EPA about the need for a new national pollutant discharge elimination system permit before any dumping into Cape Cod Bay can take place. I'm especially gratified to hear that there will be an opportunity for meaningful public input before any such permit is issued. As a group, the federal and state delegation continue to urge the Commonwealth to enforce fully the Ocean Sanctuaries Act, which prohibits the discharge of industrial waste into Cape Cod Bay. I applaud the work of the Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel and the concerned citizens in attendance tonight for bringing to light the ongoing issues about this plan that have led me to the conclusion that the effluent discharge is the wrong choice for the people of the 9th District and for the people of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Thank you very much.
Jim, we have a question for you, but first I want to know if anyone from Senator Warren's office is out there who might want to, do they want to say anything? Is it Caleb?
Yes, hello. I will keep it very brief tonight. I know we have a long night ahead of us, but my name is Caleb White. I am the Regional Director for the South Coast, Cape and Islands in the office of Senator Warren. Just a thank you to everyone there tonight. As Mike and Jim have both mentioned, we are actively following this, actively keeping up to date on this, exploring all options and the safety options available to us, and we'll continue to do so. Excited to hear comments and questions tonight, and always welcome to receive anything to our office if need be. But thank you.
Caleb, we appreciate you participating tonight. Thank you. Jim, I think there's a question from you from Ms. Lampert.
Sure, please.
Yes. I'm reading a November 17th, 2022 letter from Holtec to Senator Markey, Senator Warren, Congressman Keating. What caught my eye was the second to last paragraph on page 2, where Holtec says, "We expect that all methods of water treatment will be utilized, including treated water release, evaporation, transport for final disposition at an approved facility, or on-site storage." So in other words, they're saying the discharge into the bay is not off the table, despite the fact that EPA, DEP, the Attorney General, our congressional representatives, some of our state representatives, towns from Provincetown to Situate, excluding Kingston. So is it correct they don't understand no?
I could not speak on behalf of Holtec clearly, but what I can do is refer to the letter that was sent from the EPA to Holtec specifically, and this is the June 17th letter that indicates that an interpretation by Holtec was quote unquote novel, which was a kind way of saying incorrect, because the letter goes on to say that the 2020 permit that was given by the EPA to Holtec is clear on its face, and the meaning is expressly corroborated from comments that discharge of pollutants in water stored in the spent fuel pool, the dryer, separator pit, torus, or reactor cavity are not authorized by the current NPDES permit. They summarize a 3-page letter saying Holtec is not authorized at all under the current permit to discharge any pollutants in spent fuel pool water, that they would have to go forward and apply for a NPDES permit. There's a lengthy process to ensure that every citizen there and every member of NDCAP are heard in that process, so that getting to an inference of your question, Pixie, is that that NIPTES permit would be required, or an amendment would be required first. I cannot speak to anything else that you're asking as far as what Holtec would have in their mind.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the hard work of all of your offices.
Thank you.
Thank you.
John.
Henrietta, question for the federal delegation?
No, I just
No?
have a statement from the leader of the Herring Pond Wampanoag community, the First People. I think it's pretty important.
Yeah,
And
okay,
it
so we
it
can, we'll
really
do that
can't
later
wait
under
until
public.
8:30, no.
It can. So any other panel members have a question or any comments with respect to the federal delegation? Okay, thank you. Jim, you still there?
I'm here, yep.
So is it safe to say that at least with respect to the communication between Holtec and the federal and state delegations, the lines are always open and the communication is strong, correct?
No, I think that's fair. We have continuously been in contact, all members of the delegation, with Holtec, as we do with NDCAP. And as recently as, I think, October 27th, we had a meeting with Holtec where we have been discussing not only our joint belief of all three federal offices that a NIPTES permit amendment is required, but also discussing the four options. The one thing I would say to the question that was just asked by Pixie Lampert is it's good in writing to see previously people were concerned that there was not to be consideration of trucking the waste away. That is in the most recent letter saying that is one of the four options. So that's an important note to make. And I would note too, John, that we talk with you directly. Often there's contact with Holtec because there is a memorandum of understanding that we're trying to arrange between the independent experts and Holtec to make sure that ideally can be arranged so that at a future NDCAP meeting that would be able to hear from these folks and how they would proceed in that lengthy process. So it's a long way of saying, yes, we're in constant contact with all the relevant parties and with all of our stakeholders, because we've also had meetings with the leading stakeholders who are represented there tonight, along with Congressman Keating and Senator Warren's office. So we are in constant contact with all these parties.
Jim, again, thank you. I just wanted to invite Senator Sue Moran, who I believe is logged in, if she wants to come in and make a couple of comments. I see her on the Zoom on Mary's laptop, so I don't know if Senator Moran, are you there?
Thank you, John.
You're welcome.
Yes, I am. Thank you so much, and apologize for not being there in person. I'm kind of double scheduled myself, but I also want to appreciate the federal delegation's update. As I think as Jim mentioned, we've been in frequent contact. I guess the point that I'll make that's a little bit different from what was made earlier is that the legislation that I filed, which would provide for a citizens group and a period of study on economic and health issues, which was very detailed, worked out with the governor's administration as to the way to put forth the terms of that legislation, and which was passed in both the Senate and in the House, but which very shockingly the governor ultimately vetoed. We are on it, working with Reps Muratori and Lenatra and others. We are very steadfast in continuing to put forth that legislative administration. So that's my update, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the opportunity.
You're welcome, Senator. I had communicated with Rep Muratori, and he indicated that himself and Rep Lenatra weren't going to come in tonight, but they were looking forward to coming back in late January at the next meeting and have an agenda item. So obviously, you're more than welcome to join them. when we get to that meeting. Thank you. Okay. All right, moving on to the next agenda item. You have an update from Holtec, HDI Pilgrim, decommissioning update from Mr. Dave Noyes.
Good evening. So the first item on our update on the decommissioning status at Pilgrim is the waterfall chart. We go over this at each of our updates. And there are 6 swim lanes associated with decommissioning. There are 6 individual work streams, and they are identified here. I'll briefly go over 3 of them that don't have their own standalone slides associated with them. Overall, you'll see that there's no change to the key dates for license termination plan submittal in 2024 and partial site release in 2027 as we move forward on the key elements of our major work streams. For characterization, which is the one on the top, for radiological characterization of the site, we are scoping core bores of slabs where we have demolished buildings down to those ground level slabs. And that's for the purposes of taking those core bores and getting those samples for radiological sampling for the potential for future site release. And we're working on development of the license termination plan chapters that will be submitted to the NRC for final or partial termination of the license when we move to just a license for the ISFAC. For the non-rad portion of the characterization, we are contracting for the PCB removal. PCBs were discovered in Para 3, one of the outlying areas of the site. And we are working on a cleanup plan that will need to be approved by the state prior to that removal and resampling of those areas. We're also working on the further characterization of the MCP reportable conditions, the identification of non-radiological pollutants that were discovered on the site proper. We have completed groundwater flow mapping. And we have devised the scheme for follow-up sampling that'll be performed on the groundwater monitoring wells. For the ISFAC, or the Independent Spent Fuel Storage Installation, we continue to monitor the cask conditions, both visual inspections, radiological inspections of the cask with no anomalies noted, and preparation for the winter season to ensure that we have snow removal equipment and everything that we need in order to maintain the proper cooling on the dry cask storage facility. And then, excuse me, the bottom swim lane is site restoration, and that will come up in the future. For ongoing demolition activities at the site, this is a picture of the trash compaction facility. It was a facility that was used for readying radiological waste for shipment from the site. We have commenced demolition on that building. There is a short duration hold on demolition due to discovery of some asbestos-containing material inside an interior wall. So it was not discovered on the original characterization of the building, but the workers stopped when they identified suspect material. We worked with the state to get a non-traditional work plan developed. We expect to commence the abatement activities on the 14th of December with completion of the abatement and the removal of the remaining structure before the holiday and the end of the year. Also, for demolition, upcoming priorities include the Safety Enhancement Program building. It was a building that housed a diesel-driven water fire pump, and that building has been readied for demolition. There is trace of asbestos-containing material that will be disposed of in the first quarter of 2023. Followed by structural demolition of that building. Also, the old main gate, which was housed the central alarm station at one point for the facility, and then the secondary alarm station for security at a different point in the plant's history. We have completed gapping of that structure. Gapping is the separation of sources of energy and utilities that allow us to be able to proceed with demolition. And then we will move ahead with the abatement of some asbestos material in that building in the first quarter, and also structural demolition in the first quarter next year. So with respect to the overall site, more than 70% of outbuildings on the site have been demolished. Those are represented in red. The ones that are identified in green are scheduled to be removed by the end of the spring of 2023. They include, in addition to the SEP diesel building that we talked about before, in the old main gate, the plant's central alarm station building, the station blackout diesel generator, security diesel generator enclosures, the two remaining underground storage tanks, fuel storage tanks, those being the ones for the auxiliary heating boilers. Those will be removed in the spring, and 4 above-ground tanks, including the 1 remaining fire water storage tank, 2 condensate storage tanks, 1 demineralized water storage tank. That'll complete the majority of our outbuilding demolition priorities by the end of the spring of next year. For reactor segmentation, we continue with work to package waste materials, the control rod blades that were used to control the nuclear reaction when the reactor was operational, with 40 of 173 blades having been crushed and readied for shipment. Fuel support castings, which were the components which supported the weight of the individual fuel assemblies within the reactor when the plant was operational. Those fuel support castings are being removed and readied for radioactive waste shipment. And the control rod guide tubes. That's a picture of the control rod guide tube with a mock-up that we did outside. The guide tube was a new guide tube, and we did a mock-up to be able to prove the technique for being able to laser cut the control rod guide tube that allows us to more efficiently package those prior to future shipment of that material. In the first quarter of 2023, we'll continue with reactor disassembly of the vessel core plate and also the jet pumps, which combine the recirculating water flow with feed water flow to provide forced circulation of the reactor core when the plant was operating.
So those activities that you just listed are all activities that are being done underwater?
That's correct, yes.
And that water is required for shielding the workers to be removed?
Yes, it is. So for regulatory affairs update, we did receive in the third quarter inspection by the NRC a severity level 4, which is a violation of very low safety significance associated with gaps in monitoring of airborne radiological conditions back in 2020 when we were doing removal of the control rod drive mechanisms within the plant's dry well. We have entered that issue into our corrective action program. We're in the process of performing a causal analysis, and we have incorporated important learnings that we gained into lessons learned that we're currently using and will be used for future activities. For the Pilgrim waste update, so to date in 2022, we have shipped 76,000 cubic feet of Class A waste and 62 cubic feet of Class C waste. We'll continue with packaging of material. We have a very busy schedule for the remainder of the year for shipping the Class A waste. Class B and C waste, for the most part, is we are designing a specific cast system that will be used to ship the B and C waste, and that needs to be federally licensed before any of that material could be shipped. So that material will be staged on site until that cast system is prepared for use. We committed to an update last time on the radiological constituents of the water associated with past radiological discharges. This is not a current sample of any of the water that is in any of the on-site water volumes. This is, in fact, a treated water tank that was discharged in May of 2015. It was the last treated water tank that was discharged in plant history. You can see of the 19,000 gallons of treated water that were discharged on that date, there were 6 isotopes that were identified during both gamma and beta analysis of the water to be discharged. They included manganese 54, iron 59, cobalt 58, cobalt 60, tritium, and iron 55. The concentrations associated with those are as you see them. The units are in microcuries per milliliter. So a microcurie per milliliter is a measure of radioactivity, which is disintegrations, radiological disintegrations per unit time. And then divided by unit volume, 1 liter of water. So the 2 isotopes that are identified there that are grayed out, the iron 59 and the cobalt 58, they have extremely short half-lives, such that any future discharge of water from the site would not have any radioactivity associated with either of those 2 isotopes. They've gone through greater than 10 half-life decays, so any radiation associated with those 2 isotopes would no longer be present. And just by way of comparison, I put down the Cape Cod Bay naturally occurring radioactivity sample, which was performed at the station in August of this year. Potassium-40 is a naturally occurring radioactive isotope. It has a 1.25 billion year half-life, and its concentration was higher than any of the isotopes in the discharge that happened in 2015, with the exception of tritium.
Yes.
Andrew, go ahead.
Hi, a little new to this, so can you explain to me on the previous slide?
Yeah.
What exactly is the point that that analysis is supposed to speak to?
It was a request of the committee to provide the radiological constituents of a treated water tank that had been historically discharged from the plant. That's all.
And you don't assign any meaning to it?
What's that?
You don't assign any meaning to it?
I assign the meaning that if you take a look at the percentage of those individual isotopes compared to, say, a federal limit associated with 10 CFR Part 20, the discharges are in the area of about 2% of allowed values based on federal law.
And so, not a problem then?
Very,
From your
very,
perspective.
very low radioactivity, determined by years and years of study to not have biological impact on the environment or on people.
Dave, you had mentioned, I forget which one, it might have been the cobalt and the iron. You were talking, how do you said something to the effect that it's already gone through 10 half-lives to arrive where it is now?
Yes.
Or in 2015 or whenever.
Yes.
So how do you know it's already, I don't know the science, how do you know that it's already gone through 10 of those half-lives to get to where it was?
So it decays very predictably over time. So its energy level reduces over time consistently. Those particular isotopes decay with a known period of time by a certain amount. So half-life is the amount of radioactive potency of the item, and within that period of time, within that half-life period of time, that energy is half.
Thank you. Mary?
Is it the point that if you are to comply with state laws, for example, if you are excuse me, if you are to comply with state laws, which we'll talk about later, that, for example, the Ocean Sanctuaries Act, that it doesn't allow any pollutants. And so why is it relevant? And whether, you know, in the past it was treated, but you can't get everything out. And so because you can't get everything out, which our own reports indicate 90 to 95%, there's still 5%. So that's not nothing. And you're supposed to be at zero, nothing. So that's where I'm not quite getting it. It's not like for the NRC that had allowable rates.
Mm-hmm.
That isn't what we're dealing with here.
We could debate, and probably will, the applicability of the Ocean Sanctuaries Act. It's very clear that the NEPDES permit and the surface water discharge permit exempt radionuclides as pollutants.
No.
No.
They are radiological byproducts, and they are exempt from the jurisdiction of the NEPDES permit and the surface water discharge permit.
Well, we'll discuss that
Yes.
later then.
I had one other question.
Henrietta?
Yeah, I also just wanted to point out, maybe I'm not understanding this, but the water that you are citing that was tested in 2015, is that water was not from the spent fuel pool, was it?
It was from a conglomeration of places. It was water that may have been from seals, leakage on pumps from the spent fuel pool system, water that had been used as part of cavity flood up, that there was insufficient volume to be able to hold it within the condensate storage tanks. The volume of water during a plant refueling outage, as like what occurred in that spring period in 2015, is essentially commingled. And that could have come from several different waste streams, including spent fuel pool water.
But it is not really equivalent to the water that we are talking about now.
We don't know yet. We're not done with the water.
Okay. Dave, you got, Jim, go ahead.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, we're gonna go there next.
All right, Dave, you got more?
I do.
Okay.
All right, so we also committed to provide an update with respect to an assessment of the non-radiological levels of pollutants within the on-site water volumes. So you can see the water volumes in each of the three sources: the spent fuel pool with its 280,000 gallons, dryer separator pit and reactor cavity, 400,000 gallons, and the Taurus with 285,000 gallons of water. We analyzed those against the EPA's list of priority pollutants. Priority pollutants is a set of chemical pollutants that the EPA regulates and has developed analytical test methods for. So it's comprised of 126 metals, semi-volatile and volatile organic analytes, and the analysis was conducted by an off-site laboratory of a sample for 125 of the 126 EPA priority pollutants. The one exception was asbestos. We were unable to find a laboratory when we were performing this work that could test for asbestos in a radiological sample. We have since found one, and future sampling will include asbestos. Asbestos is not part of the plant's primary system waste stream, so we don't anticipate finding levels of asbestos, but if we do, we'd respond to that when we get those sample results. So out of the 126 or 125 priority pollutants that we sampled for, in the spent fuel pool, we found 2, nickel and zinc. In the dryer separator pit and reactor cavity, we found 1, that is zinc. In the torus, we found at detectable levels copper, lead, nickel, and zinc. And again, it's important to point out that this water has not yet in any way been treated. Prior to final disposition of this water, whatever it might be, it will go through a treatment process that will include filtration and demineralization, and would result likely in these particular metals that were found being below detection limits. We did see boron in all 3 volumes. They were at roughly 20 and 126 micrograms per liter respectively. Boron is naturally occurring in seawater at a concentration of 4,500 micrograms per liter. So the concentration of boron in those water volumes, even in its pretreated form, is significantly below the baseline boron values that exist in seawater, and also below the limit of the permit for one of the permitted outfalls, which is outfall number 11. And that permit limit is 1,000 micrograms per liter above the measured ambient, which would be 4,500 micrograms per liter.
Dave, just a quick question. Why are you focusing on priority pollutants? Because in EPA's website, NEPD's Permit Basics, the Clean Water Act prohibits anyone from discharging pollutants through a point source into the water of the United States unless they have a NEPD's permit. So do you think the prohibition only applies to priority pollutants?
They are the set of pollutants that are most readily tested for, unless there's indication in any process stream that something other than a priority pollutant may exist.
Andrew? So taking that last slide, I'll ask a similar question. So given that, what conclusion do you draw, and what implications does it have for your future next steps?
The conclusion that I draw from this is that post-treatment, there will be no level of detectable priority pollutants in the water that will be dispositioned from Pilgrim Station.
And is it then your position that you are then legally authorized to discharge that at your discretion into the bay?
Give me a minute to get to the next slide, and I think it'll answer that question.
I'll be back.
May I ask one question?
Good question.
Is it Holtec's expectation, putting priority pollutants to one side, that there will be no pollutants whatever in the water that is discharged?
We have what is identified as potential pollutants in the water, and that's what we have analyzed for.
That wasn't really the question I asked. The question I asked is whether your system,
Yes.
you expect, is capable of removing not only most of the pollutants, and it looks like it does a pretty good job of that if you really get rid of 90 to 95. But as Mr. Trice told the EPA, if you expect this to get to zero, that's extraordinarily expensive, and effectively our equipment won't do it. So my question is, do you expect when you get to the point of discharge that there will be zero pollutants, priority or otherwise, in the discharge?
If you give me just a minute, I think this
Of course.
last slide will help to answer that question. So where we're moving forward now is we're installing a Taurus water filtering system. The system is designed for micron filtration, so it will essentially remove particulate pollutants down to a level of about 1/100th the size of a human hair at 1 micron effective filtration capability. We're also moving forward with sampling a treated water tank for non-radiological pollutants, as well as shared split samples of on-site water volumes with our stakeholders that will result, with the results being provided to the experts appointed by Senator Markey's office for their independent review and evaluation. We are also proceeding with submitting a NEPDES and surface water discharge permit modification. That modification, coupled with the essentially very high quality of the water, we believe will enable us to be able to, without reservation by EPA or Mass DEP, to be able to move forward with plans for discharge.
Can I ask a follow-up question, Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Now I'm actually a little bit more confused than I was when we started. Why submit a modification to a permit that I thought I'd read you didn't think applied?
This is the path that, that EPA has given for us to be able to move forward. We still have some reservations about the application of portions of the permit, but we are going to move forward with the plans to modify the permit because that's the path that the regulator has given us to move forward.
Is it fair to say you've been given some type of assurance that should you get down to the no detects as you described, that you'd get a modification that will allow you to discharge?
We've been given no assurance.
And given your previous position about the inapplicability of Clean Water Act and NPDES permitting for these types of discharges, if you don't get the permit modification, do you intend to go forward anyway?
I think it's a mixture of two things, what you're discussing. The non-applicability has to do with the radiological byproducts. These are the chemical constituents. These are the non-radiological pollutants.
So no contest on your part that that part does apply? The non-radiological pollutants are subject to permitting, and that you'd need to get a permit in order to be able to discharge anything.
That's the path that we've been given, and that's what we're going to pursue.
Do you accept, I mean, is that just the path of least resistance, or do you accept the jurisdictional determination?
Well, there are always other pathways, right? If we get to the point where we reach an impasse in the permitting process, but we will make every good faith effort to modify the permit and move forward.
So what would the timeline of that permit modification process be, to the best of your understanding now? And what does that mean in terms of the earliest time by which you think you would be able to discharge?
We're still in the process of laying that out, and then we'll have some additional communication with both EPA and Mass DEP to make sure that we have a good understanding of what the timeline is, but we don't have that yet.
And there will be no discharge prior to the resolution of the permit issue?
I can't say that.
Dave Nichols?
Thank you.
Yeah, Dave, I mean, you mentioned earlier in your presentation that you found PCBs, you didn't expect to find PCBs. You mentioned that you found asbestos and you didn't expect to find asbestos. I'm curious why you wouldn't fully characterize the water instead of only looking for the 125 priority pollutants in case there is one other pollutant in there that you didn't expect to find. Wouldn't it just make sense to know everything that's in it?
It's typical practice to characterize a waste stream based on the components that come in contact with that waste stream. There is no reason to believe it. I mean, asbestos and PCBs are included in the priority pollutant list. They're being evaluated.
No, but my point was you found stuff you didn't expect to find in other areas of the plant.
Right.
I understand the typical practice and the standard care or practice is just to look for the 125, but in this instance, wouldn't you want to know? And maybe it's a better question for the state because they might look for stuff you're not looking for, but I would think that Holtec would want to know everything that's in that water and not just whether 125 things are not in the water.
Yeah, good point. One question.
Mary?
I sent you an email on October 10th, and I know you're busy and I didn't get an answer, but I'd like an answer now. And this is what I asked, will Holtec agree to give the panel Senator Markey, Senator Warren, Representative Keating, Senator Moran, Senator Sears, Senator O'Connor, and the Mass Attorney General not less than 30 days advance notice before you discharge any of Pilgrim's water, whether or not processed into Cape Cod Bay?
I don't know the answer to that, Mary. I can't answer that.
Is there any time period you could give an answer to, whether it be 15 days, 10 days, 5 days, 30 minutes?
Yeah, no, I'll have to get back to you.
Well, I would like to get back and to know this, and this is based...
We are working with Senator Markey's experts. We are working with the state to characterize the water and to understand what's in it. And we're doing that transparently, and we're doing that in good faith, and we'll continue to do that.
And so notice would be part of good faith, correct?
Dave? So number 2.
Yes.
That's referring to the 2015 data that you presented on an earlier slide, correct?
It would be the water that is currently in the spent fuel pool or one of those volumes having been treated and then sampled. So it would be a contemporary sample of the same volume.
Which hasn't occurred yet?
No.
Okay.
No, it's next steps.
Okay, that's next step. So everything you did tonight was respect to the 2015 other...
The radiological
correct.
was. The non-radiological have all taken place within the last 3 months.
All right, so you're still moving through this process of you're going to sample, you're going to use number 2, you're going to take that sample, and we're going to get off the Mass DEP, we're going to get off to Mr. Priest and others. And I'll ask Jack to weigh in here too. So when we get to that point where those samples are going to be taken, who's going to be present, what is that process going to look like when those samples are taken? And are these samples only going to be, is Holtec going to be getting their own analysis, and then the state will be doing a separate analysis, and then Ed Markey, in a perfect world, Senator Markey, will have a third independent analysis? Is that what we're all looking for?
I don't think that...
I can speak to that.
Go ahead.
So what the state, yeah, it's on, sorry, not speaking into it. Can you hear me now?
No.
No? Yes? Okay, all right. My name's Jack Priest. I'm the Director of the Radiation Control Program. I work for the Department of Public Health. I'm the representative of the Commissioner for those who haven't met me previously. So, Mass Department of Public Health and the Mass DEP are working together. We're going to go to the station, and I don't want to take away Seth's thunder here if he's presenting some information tonight. So the sampling will be samples from 3 locations in the plant: spent fuel pool, dryer separator pit, and the Taurus. We'll observe them collect the samples. We evidence tape them. We'll take them back to the Massachusetts Environmental Radiation Laboratory, and then I will take from those samples and do the radio analytical analysis. And I look at all of the principal radionuclides that are specified by the federal regulations to review. And that's consistent what we've done over the years with environmental samples. The DEP samples requires an external laboratory that they're working to finalize a contract with, because those samples are also potentially radioactive. So that laboratory has to be able to handle radioactive material and do the pollutant non-radioactive sampling. And I'll let the DEP talk about the list of things that they are going to look at. Those results are what we intend to provide to Senator Markey's expert panel. So this water that we're going to be looking at is the raw, untreated, as it is in the pool right now, so that would potentially be the worst case. It's a point-in-time sample that is not going to be through that treatment system that Dave talked about. So we'll have basically the raw water data, and that's what we're working to get that communicated back to the panel in January for the next meeting. That's dependent on the amount of time it will take the independent laboratory to look at the non-radioactive components.
Jack, thank you.
I gather that all of those are pre-treatment samples you're talking about at the moment?
That's correct. It's going to be the raw water samples right from those 3 locations.
Because my understanding of the way the system works is there will be a batch, you're going to test what goes into that batch for treatment. But number 2 here talks about apparently sampling after treatment.
Yep, so...
Are you planning to take samples there also?
So what Dave's noise explained is that they will provide additional samples, and we haven't confirmed whether we would do that. It's most likely we would. I mean, that makes sense to me, but I have to go through my chain of command and work with DEP to look at those as well. So I would expect, now, I asked that question about the jet pumps that they were going to be working on disassembling, so we know that they're going to continue to use that water at least into the second quarter of 2023.
My reason for...
And there'll be some time, Jim, to circulate that water to go through their treatment system, and then I would expect that we would have a sample. When they say it's done, we're done treating it, it's ready to be released, if that's the path that's going to be taken, we would again sample to validate the results that Holtec got.
I'm glad to hear that, because it just strikes me that if we're looking at eventual discharge in the bay, the most important thing is after treatment, not before treatment. And I think we all need to recognize that even after treatment, the water is highly diluted before it is sent down the discharge canal, as Holtec's previous reports to the NRC make pretty clear.
That's true. So historically, when you've looked at water that has been treated and then discharged with dilution water, it's below the level of detectability.
Which I would expect if you have enough dilution, and sometimes it's thousands of gallons of dilution to a single gallon of treated water.
Correct.
All right, Mary, to my right.
Thank you. I have a question in either,
There's a floor question.
sorry.
No, we can't do that tonight. Mary, to my right.
Could I ask the depth of the tank, please, and you can take samples from the bottom of the tank?
That's going to be what my question is. If you mind, let me answer.
Yep.
Gentlemen, is there a sampling protocol that you guys are required to use for sampling these water? for
We are
sampling the
working
waters?
with Holtec to ensure that the samples that we take are representative of the volume of water that's at those 3 locations. So it's not going to be, I walk over to the edge with a dip bucket and grab water off the top. It has to be representative of the water that's in the tank.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you answering that.
Dave, anything else?
No, sir.
Okay, Seth, you're up. Andrew, one more.
Actually, after Seth.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Seth Pickering from Mass DEP. I'm here to give the interagency work group update for this NDCAP meeting. So I'd like to start with the first item has to do with the water discharge permits. That is the big topic of discussion tonight. So Mass DEP, the Department of Public Health, the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and the Attorney General's Office participated in a meeting that was held at US EPA, and Holtec was there on October 17th of 2022. Consistent with prior letters issued by EPA, it was made clear at the meeting that any proposal by Holtec to discharge water from the spent fuel pool or other decommissioning-related wastewater into Cape Cod Bay would require authorization under a new or modified National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NPDES permit, or Mass DEP Surface Water Discharge permit. It would also require additional state and federal reviews, including Mass DEP water quality certification, federal consistency review by the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management, and if considered a new or increased discharge, review under the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act, or MEPA. Due to the complexity of these reviews and the length of time that would be involved, Holtec was advised to engage in pre-filing consultations with the relevant agencies, if in fact Holtec does plan to pursue discharge options. So as stated in prior meetings, US EPA and Mass DEP have not received a formal request by Holtec to discharge water from the spent fuel pool or other decommissioning-related wastewater into the bay. So Mass DEP's position continues to be that Holtec must comply with the requirements of the current NPDES and surface water discharge permit, which prohibit the discharge of pollutants in spent fuel pool water and other decommissioning-related wastewater. In conjunction with any application for an amended NPDES or surface water discharge permit, Holtec would need to submit to EPA and Mass DEP comprehensive sampling of the spent nuclear fuel pool water and other decommissioning-related wastewater. So I'd like to be able to ask Gerard Martin, who is my colleague from Mass DEP, to come up and hit the next couple of points as we talk about the future Mass DEP and Department of Public Health sampling, split sampling that we're planning on doing in the future. Is that good, Chairman?
Yes, absolutely.
Want the slides up?
Okay, magic. And our slides are up over there. And yes, Jack did steal a little bit of our thunder tonight, but that's okay. It was important to have that question answered at the time. So as we did mention, we'll be sampling at 3 locations, the spent fuel pool, the separated dry pits, and the Taurus. Sampling will be conducted by Holtec personnel. It is their equipment, but observed by Mass DEP and Mass DPH, where we will take the samples, and as Jack mentioned, bring them back to their lab, and we will get the samples to the lab that we're contracting with on our own and using the lab. Our lab is an independent lab. We got a list of a number of labs that do this type of work, and we're making sure we're not using the same lab that Holtec uses to make sure that they are really genuine split samples. And this is a schematic of the plant showing where the 3 samples are coming from: the spent fuel pool, the separated dryer pit, and then down on the bottom, the Taurus. And the Taurus is like a big tubular ring along the bottom of the plant. So the 3 samples will come from those 3 individual locations. And there was a little talk earlier about what the samples will be analyzed for, and we too started with the priority pollutants because that's typically what you do. It is, and a lot of people were throwing around a number of 125 pollutants. It's not. It's much larger than that. It's 125 pollutant groups, if you will. There are some that are individual, but there are a lot that include a lot of different contaminants. You can look at the list. For example, metals, you look at metals, and there's a number of metals there that we'll be doing, including boron, which is the B. We're also doing antimony, and I left it off. I apologize. Cyanide, sodium nitrate, asbestos, semi-volatile organic compounds, polycyclic aromatic compounds is a whole list of contaminants. It's not just one contaminant. It's many contaminants. And the same goes for the volatile organic compounds. That includes compounds that are in gasoline, chlorinated solvents, a whole list of volatile organic compounds that are used at different industrial sites. So it's not 125. PFAS, there's many PFAS, that's the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, the new contaminant that we're dealing with across the Commonwealth and across the country. Many contaminants on that list. We regulate 6 of them, and then PCB is the same thing. There's many different congeners of PCBs. So it is much more than the 125 that's been kicked around, and it's pretty comprehensive. We started with the priority pollutant list, but we also added a few other things. We added some of the parameters that are in the NPDES permit that aren't on the priority pollutant list. That makes sense. And we also did a literature search on potential contaminants from nuclear power plants. And if there was something that wasn't on our list that we found in that literature search, we added that to our list as well. We've shared this list with Holtec, and when we do the next split samples, they'll be doing the same analysis as we do, but with that different lab. And as far as the radioactive materials, as Jack mentioned, and can go into this in more detail, they'll analyze the samples for tritium and the principal gamma emitters consistent with the NRC requirements. So as we mentioned, we're working with our contractor. We couldn't use one of the state contract labs, as Jack pointed out, so we're using them to hire a radiological lab to do the sampling, and our goal is to have the results by the next NDCAP.
Gerard, just one question. You mentioned 3 sampling points. I don't think the reactor vessel was on that list, but it's my understanding that was the source of some of the water that Holtec has to dispose of.
Yep. The separated dryer pit is the same water as the reactor vessel.
That's the same as the reactor vessel? Yeah. Thank you.
Gerard, Dave, go ahead.
Thank you for clarifying that you're looking, it sounds like you're looking for a more comprehensive characterization of the water than what Mr. Noyes described.
Actually, just a little more. I mean, the priority pollutants covered a lot of what they're required to do under their permit.
Okay.
Okay. It's a very comprehensive list.
Are there pollutants that you could find in your review, though, that can't be cleaned or treated?
Not that I can think of off the top of my.
Okay.
They're all pretty treatable. You know?
Right.
He was asking if there's any of that whole list of contaminants, if there's any that can't be treated. And we have pretty good treatment technologies today. Unfortunately, some of these contaminants that are on the priority pollutant list also impact our public water supplies, and we're able to treat them before they get to your tap.
Okay.
I think it's fair to say we'd review the results of our analytical work and then go back and look at their treatment systems to have them validate that that treatment system would be capable of removing that pollutant.
And then there'd be the sampling post-treatment, too,
That's
to
correct.
demonstrate that.
All right, Gerard, before we go to Andrew. So how big is the team, the state delegation, not the elected, but the appointed officials going in that day to sample? Is it 6 employees, 12, 2?
It will probably be 3 or 4, including Seth and myself.
And me.
No,
Okay.
I was thinking DEP, sorry.
Any representatives from our U.S. senators tag along, or is just the 4 of you?
That would be up to Holtec.
That's up to Holtec.
So I'm just saying.
There'll be a typical chain of custody, you know, which is required under the.
But if I wanted to request a representative from a U.S. senator being there, or Mike Jackman from Congressman Keating's office be there, it's okay if those witnesses are there as long as they're approved by Holtec. Is that what you're saying?
We don't have authority to provide them access.
Okay, all right. I got the message, thank you.
But, yeah.
But what?
So I think that confused people at
Okay.
that statement. So,
No, I
for the people that are in the audience, you're still required to have access to get into the plant.
Correct.
The state agencies don't provide access, Holtec does. So that process to get them into the plant for security reasons would go through Holtec. The state agencies, we don't object to having an additional person there if they want to watch us collect water samples.
Right. It's just not your job to facilitate the entry.
Correct.
Okay. Andrew?
Yeah, thank you for, well, the question I was going to ask before Seth and Gerard was about whether you were looking at some of the contaminants for emerging concern that the water supply side has to look on. It sounds like you had a pretty good overlap on that list. Are you doing just the 6 PFAS that you're regulating for drinking water purposes?
No, typically when we do PFAS analysis, it's for the longer list. You know, we focus on the 6 because they're the ones we have standards for, but we look at everything.
Okay. And then, if, just to understand the permit framework a little bit. So, you're going to hate this.
I know I am.
You know. If the existing permit prohibits the discharge that's under consideration, are you looking at this as a modification or a new or increased discharge? So are we permitting a new activity or are we amending an existing permit? And let me tell you, not to play gotcha, the reason I'm asking is if it's new, then don't the anti-degradation provisions apply? And how does that change your considerations?
Well, the discussions we've been having with our Boston office and with the EPA is a modification to the existing permits, but we've also been talking about applying the anti-degradation provisions.
Even within
in
a
that process.
modification?
Yes.
Is that an appealable determination?
I couldn't say off the top of my head.
All right, I would suggest the department look long and hard at where the weak points are, you know, in that determination, in the event, to try and preclude, appeals.
Yes.
That might undermine your ultimate determination, because the anti-degradation provisions bring in some significant new heft to what you can require and what you can't allow.
Right.
Thanks.
And as a permit, there are appeal processes.
Right.
Could you explain in English what the anti-degradation provision is? I mean, I have no idea, and so what you just talked about was meaningless.
I would probably be better at it for the Massachusetts contingency plan. I'm not that comfortable with it with the discharge permits.
We can check it out.
Maybe
And
So,
as a retired DEP employee, who had some domain over these programs,
So Andrew, if we want to get that on the record as a question, we'll be glad to do the research and try to get you an answer by the next NDCAP.
I mean, I think, DEP's answer is the really relevant and controlling answer. An interpretation of it is that for a new discharge, not only do you have to meet the discharge standard, so if you're putting a constituent of 20 and you're doing 19, you could go ahead under a normal permit. But anti-degradation precludes you from making existing conditions worse or introducing new contaminants, even if you meet the regulatory standard. So it's a higher level of protection than a standard NPDES permit would provide for an existing or modification of an existing.
Thank you.
But Seth, if you want to fine-tune that for 2 months from now, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, we'll check into it for sure.
Thank
you. You bet.
Any other questions for Seth or Gerard?
Well, we have
We still
more
have a couple
of a report out. We have the site assessment work plan stuff that Gerard's going to talk about real quick. That's the MCP stuff.
Oh, okay.
And then
I'm
I got a
sorry.
little
Go ahead.
bit more after that.
Okay. So on the site assessment work plan, Mass DEP and DPH with the AGO are continuing to review Holtec's response to the formal comments provided by the state on 1/26/22, and the work plan must be approved by the state under the settlement agreement reached with the Commonwealth. Second bullet, Mass DEP, DPH, MEMA, and the AGO are continuing to review Holtec's radioactive waste management plan, which was submitted in response to the AGO's noncompliance letter sent on November 22nd, 21. And as Dave alluded to, they are working on the Massachusetts contingency plan assessment and cleanup of the non-radioactive material on the properties associated with the Pilgrim facility. We met with them about a week and a half ago to go over the work that had been worked on so far and talked about additional sampling that they need to do under the Massachusetts contingency plan, and they're proceeding with that. The next deliverable under the Massachusetts contingency plan, or MCP, is the Phase 2 comprehensive site assessment, and that's a site assessment that identifies the full extent of non-rad oil and hazardous material at the property, both vertical and horizontal, and includes a risk assessment of looking at those contaminants and the concentrations and potential exposures. What is the risk associated with those? And that is what's used to design the cleanup of the non-rad oil and hazardous material. That Phase 2 is due in April 2025. It's 3 years from the time that they tier classified, which was last April. And we give them 3 years under the regulations because it's usually a very comprehensive report to figure out how widespread this contamination is. We also discussed, as Dave mentioned, the PCB contamination in some of the soil. There were soil piles found on the property, and that they are looking to dispose of that material under the Massachusetts contingency plan, and that will include review and approval by our office.
Thank you. Any questions on that?
That it?
Quickly, on other cleanup issues, so the DEP asbestos section is continuing to be actively engaged in overseeing the demolition activity that's occurring at the site. We meet regularly with the company to manage the asbestos discovery, identification, abatement, and removal process, as Dave alluded to earlier. Gerard and I were on site Friday, the 18th of November, to observe completed demolition activities and to check on remaining plant equipment status. A lot has changed based on Dave's update on the things that have been demolished. Let's see, also, Holtec has requested that they be able to change their wastewater disposal system, so their existing wastewater treatment plant to a Title V system in the future, and Mass DEP is evaluating this request. This is because the wastewater flows at the facility have been reduced by almost tenfold, and so the wastewater treatment plant on site is really way too big for the flows that it sees currently. Let's see, also, during an asbestos removal project, some paint chips that contain some asbestos-containing material that we call ACM entered an underground electrical vault that contains some water. This water, about 5,000 gallons, was filtered to remove the asbestos-containing material as required by a non-traditional work plan that Mass DEP required. And Holtec has requested to take the filtered water and introduce it into the wastewater treatment plant for disposal. DEP, given that some of the water in the vault was likely groundwater, and the groundwater in the vicinity of this vault did have some PFAS impacts, we're requesting that the water be analyzed for PFAS. And Mass DEP is currently reviewing the data to determine if the water can be sent to the wastewater treatment plant or not. So Dave and John are waiting for us to get back to them on that. So that's what I have, Mr. Chairman.
Any questions for Seth, Dave?
Hopefully, this won't be a giant answer, and if it is, we can defer it. But, you talked a lot about pollutants, and I understand the difference between pollutants and radionuclides in the regulatory scheme. As you do your sampling for radionuclides, Jack, and you identify whatever the radionuclide component of the water might be, is there anything in the state regulations that you believe would give you authority that's different than the NRC and how the radionuclides are treated, not the pollutants?
The short answer is no.
Okay.
So the radionuclides are regulated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. There's dose limits that the EPA has on water discharge. There's dose limits on radionuclides that are discharged by the NRC. When we start talking about the site, So we heard we had a bunch of buildings knocked down. Part of that characterization will be to look at the ground, what's underneath, what's in the ground. And the settlement agreement talks about how they have to analyze it, the model that they need to use, like a resident farmer model, which basically is the most conservative model, or basement model, where you would expect in the future that somebody could be, as it says, a resident on that property and a farmer on that property. And then they do their dose calculation to meet that. So the limit for the NRC to members of the general public is less than 100 millirem in a year. In the settlement agreement, we agreed to have that limit at less than 10 millirem per year, which is the existing Massachusetts regulatory limit.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. All right, Seth, thank you. Moving on to Mr. Jim Lampert's presentation. We're running late. Thanks, Jim.
It's encouraging.
Yes.
Mary, did you get an advance copy?
Yeah, I did. I did edit it.
I am passing out, I've given every member of the panel here, and I've got a number of copies, not enough for everyone to circulate. But I plan to say before we got going tonight, on the theory that it's very hard to read screens. I'm Jim Lampert. As you can tell, I am now a member of the panel. I'm a graduate of MIT and of Harvard Law School, and I practiced law for about 50 years. My goal tonight is simply to give people a structure of what I understand the applicable statutes, permits, and regulations to be, and what has been said or not said about them, and leave to everyone here to make the judgment as to where we are. There are really two Clean Water Acts. One is the United States Clean Water Act that we spend most of our time talking about. And as you can see, it deals, as we said tonight, with prohibiting discharge of any pollutant unless you have a permit. This does not include, and you've heard it before, and it's absolutely true, radioactive pollutants. The permit, as the EPA tells you, will give you limits on what you can discharge, the manner in which you can discharge, what reporting you have to do, et cetera. If you want to read the current permit, and as I said, there are two of them, one issued by the state and one issued by the EPA, they're about 700 pages long. So sometime when you're having trouble sleeping, pick them up. Slide. The State Clean Water Act, it starts off with the same basic structure and premise. You cannot discharge a pollutant unless you have a permit. And the permit that Pilgrim has been given now, it's identical to the EPA one, and we'll get into exactly what it allows them to do in a couple of minutes. One of the key questions that runs through all of this, and you've obviously heard a fair amount above it tonight, is what is a pollutant? Any legal document, as I learned years and years ago, always start with the definitions. Because when you get into the guts of it, you'll probably find that a word is used in a way that no rational man would ever have used that word in the first place. A few things to note here. These statutory definitions are not all the same. what the differences are may not matter, but the definition in the U.S. Clean Water Act and the Massachusetts Clean Water Act are somewhat different. Another thing to note is that the definitions in the acts include radioactive materials. There is no exclusion for them. Particularly, they're spelled out in particularity, specifically in the U.S. Clean Water Act. Okay, you might ask, then how do we get to the fact that the permit doesn't deal with them? And that's because it has its own definition of pollutants that is different than the pollutants that are described in the overall and broader acts. One thing you have to remember for both the U.S. and the Mass Acts is the AEC Pilgrim-type pollutants aren't the only things that are radioactive that these two agencies look at. So it's quite sensible that the broad definition in the acts would include radioactive materials. But when you get down to how does the permit read, the permits reflect what I'll call it the deal between the EPA and the NRC, that the NRC would handle radioactive, contaminants, pollutants, choose your word, and EPA would limit itself to non-radioactive, and in joining in the identical permit for the purposes of this permit, Massachusetts effectively followed the same course. You'll also note that these use the word pollutant. They don't talk about priority pollutants, which to my understanding are simply a subset, and I think it's become fairly clear in what people have said tonight, of the broader concept of anything that could be a pollutant. So let's take a quick look at Pilgrim's permits and ask the first question: what do they authorize? Starting point is over on the left, that all that is authorized is discharge of what is specifically laid out in these 9 categories. None of these deal with the waters from spent fuel pool, from the Taurus, from the dryer separator, et cetera, that we talked that are among the things that Pilgrim needs to get rid of now. The permit authorizes these, but it does not authorize any others. And I guess I would have to ask Holtec if it's their understanding that the spent fuel pool water, the Taurus water, and the dryer separator are not included in this list. You may not be in a position to respond, but I think that's a critical point that everyone needs to think about and consider. My understanding is that they are not. What do they, and frankly, that would be consistent with what the EPA has said, that your current permit does not allow you to discharge water from those 3 or 4 sources. The next slide is titled, what do they not authorize? The starting point is paragraph 1. And that's the most important one. That really just restates the basic rule. It says, unless it's authorized in that list of 9, the discharge is not authorized. They could have stopped right there. But during the negotiation of the permit, there was a lot of discussion of spent fuel pool water and water that was kind of generated, churned up, if you please, during the course of decommissioning. So the last 3 paragraphs pick up on that. You might ask, why was spent fuel water not included? The short and simple answer is that Energy, who filed the application in the first place, never asked to include it. And Holtec has had to live with that choice ever since. But those last 3 categories, there's been don't think that that is all that's prohibited. What is prohibited is any pollutant that isn't listed in the list of 9 on the previous slide. We've talked about, and frankly, I was very glad to hear tonight that Holtec is planning to seek a modification, amendment, choose your words, of its existing permit. I think that reflects what they learned in no uncertain terms at the October 17th meeting, and that's been adverted to today, that the EPA is very firm in its view that you cannot discharge the spent fuel water, and I would add, or the water from the Taurus dryer separator, unless you get a new permit, or unless, and this is very important, there are no pollutants in that water at the time it is discharged. Because you'll recall that what the basic EPA rule says is you cannot discharge pollutants. If you have absolutely pure water with no pollutants, you can discharge that without a permit. Which leads us, frankly, to what is probably the 2 most important questions that the EPA and the state are going to have to decide. The first is, will processing remove all pollutants? My understanding from a long time ago at MIT, and to the extent I've kept track since, is that there is no perfect purification system. Holtec's purification system, from what they've told the NRC, is pretty good. 90 to 95% removal is a lot of pollutants removed, but it still, as Mrs. Lampert pointed out, leaves some behind. In his letter of May 24th to the EPA, Mr. Trice, the president of HDI, tried to convince the EPA, oh, you have to mean just water before it's treated. You can't expect us to get down into no pollutants. Among other things, that would require a complete redesign of our system and would cost an exorbitant amount of money. My personal view is you might be able to get lower, but cost benefits start to weigh in, and I still doubt, and again, it's the EPA and the state that are going to have to make the final decision, you would ever get to 0. Second step in that line of questions is it enough only to remove most? Only to remove 90% of them? The EPA on February 17th wrote Holtec and said the discharge of spent fuel pool water, and you could expand this to the other discharge, any other discharge that is not specifically permitted, is explicitly prohibited unless there are no, and I emphasize no, pollutants. And I gather that was the position that was taken by the EPA, and I assume DEP, at the meeting with Holtec on October 17th. Finally, and this isn't important to the EPA permits or to the present permit that's issued by the state, Massachusetts law is not limited to non-radiological pollutants. It does not exclude AEC pollutants. Tritium, as the Dr. Kammerer described last week, cannot be filtered. There will be tritium in the discharge. And a couple of the slides that Mr. Noyes showed a few minutes ago seem to indicate that there will also be some quantities of other radiological materials in that discharge. I'm not going to get into a discussion of how much. As I mentioned, this will be diluted before it's discharged. Pilgrim's past practice was to dilute everything to such an extent that A, it complied with any NRC regulations, limits on discharges, and I'm not exactly clear what those are. But second, the result of that was to ensure that when the water finally came down the discharge canal into Cape Cod Bay, there weren't sensors that were good enough, at least any sensors that they used, to detect any pollutants in that water. You look at the reports and they say not detected. It's not detectable, and why is that largely? I'm getting a little beyond. It's probably because of the extent of dilution. Because I wasn't exaggerating when I noted a few minutes ago that if you look at the prior NRC reports, the one going, last one really was in 2016 before Holtec took over, the amount of diluent that was added to the contaminated water was hundreds, if not thousands, times bigger. And eventually, you're just not going to be able to detect it. Does that make a difference? That is going to be for the EPA and the state to sort out. And the way they're going to probably sort it out is in looking at an amended permit. My best judgment, I may be right, I think so, and I may be wrong, is the EPA and the state will hold to their position that you cannot discharge under your current permit unless there are zero pollutants. But the fact that you have reduced them a great deal is highly relevant to our making a decision as to what you might be allowed to release under an amended permit. Now let's move on to Massachusetts laws and regulations. I'm putting Federal Clean Water Act to one side. There are three basic kind of time points here. The most important one goes back to the settlement agreement. Holtec, more particularly the two Holtec licensees, HDI and Holtec Pilgrim, agreed to comply, and I'm going to quote, with all applicable environmental and health-based standards and regulations of the Commonwealth. So far as I know, no other state has that type of agreement with a licensee. Massachusetts is unique. What is going to happening here is not a precedent anywhere else because that agreement doesn't exist so far as I know anyone else. It's also clear that our EPA permit, as it stands now, and we'll see what happens on the amended, is much more restrictive than that in many other states whose permits that I've read. For example, Holtec released water of the same type that it needs to get rid of here at Oyster Creek. The Oyster Creek permit, existing EPA permit, goes back a long way and is extraordinarily broad. I think it's absolutely fair for Holtec to take the position that that permit did not prohibit the discharge they made in New Jersey. Moving on, in both July and most recently in November, Holtec representatives said that they would comply with federal and state requirements. And they wouldn't discharge if they would violate them. And I think the seeking of a new permit is a giant step in that direction, and I trust that what they said they wouldn't do, they won't do. The Ocean Sanctuary Act has been mentioned. There are really two acts of the ones I've gone through that seem to be the most important here. I've talked about the Clean Water Act in connection with the current permits. As you can see there, it repeats what we said in earlier slides, thou shalt not discharge pollutants. And it broadly defines pollutants, and the words it uses to broadly define them don't mention any dichotomy between radioactive materials and non-radioactive materials. The Ocean Sanctuary Act similarly broadly prohibits the discharge of industrial or commercial waste into a protected ocean sanctuary, and Cape Cod Bay, Plymouth Bay, Kingston Bay, and Duxbury Bay are all specified in the Act as being protected ocean sanctuaries. One major difference between these mass laws, I hope I made it clear by now. Not quite. Oh, I'm sorry, my mistake. You're absolutely right. Is that the definition includes both radioactive and non-radioactive, whereas the current EPA permit doesn't talk about them. And more particularly, it neither authorizes nor prohibits them. It just leaves them all to one side. One other major difference between these acts is that the Clean Water Act plainly provides for people like Holtec to seek permits from the state. And I expect that they will do so. Whether the Ocean Sanctuaries Act does, I find a little more questionable. I've tried to read the whole thing several times, and the only discharge permits that seem to be allowed as an exception to its otherwise flat prohibition are discharges from sewage and treatment plants, public treatment plants, which Pilgrim clearly is not. Query, are there any exclusions available under the Ocean Sanctuary Act? I leave that for Holtec and the Attorney General's office to sort out. Well, where does that leave us now? My initial reaction was to say, looking at a train wreck about to occur. The EPA said in June rather, and it said again, frankly, July, August, September, October, exactly 4 months later, that Pilgrim is not authorized under the current permit to discharge pollutants. And I read it's any pollutants in spent fuel, pool water, or frankly, some other water sources. The governor-elect, then Attorney General, is on record as saying, we've got the authority to stop this discharge based on the settlement agreement and state and federal law. And I'll be damn sure, in whatever capacity I serve, we're not going to have radioactive waste dumped down here. What about Holtec? Well, Christine Legier of the Providence Independent talked to Pat O'Brien, a few weeks ago, and he said the 4 options remain on the table, one of which is clearly dumping, discharge. It's Holtec's preferred word. Holtec's letter to Senator Markey said that we expect all methods of water treatment will be employed. And these statements were made after the October 17 meeting. O'Brien also said the company continues to favor the release of water into Cape Cod Bay. Where is this going to end up? Unless there's somebody changes their course, the state and EPA locomotive and the Holtec train seem destined to run into each other.
Okay, I have a question for you, Mr. Lambert.
And frankly, let me ask a question first of both DEP people and of Holtec. Excuse me, John.
Okay, yep, just be brief, because I think there's some questions here.
Oh, sure, but I had a quick question for them, that if I have misrepresented anything that you or your agencies have said, let us know, and hopefully let us know now, so people who are sitting here have the full story and not simply my understanding of it. If there aren't any, I'll go on to any other questions that anybody has.
I have a
panel or
question.
otherwise.
Mary?
Sure.
Thank you very much. All right, in your opinion as a lawyer, because that's what you are, at what point does a constituent in the water be considered as a pollutant, like metal, tritium? What point do we call it a pollutant? I know the answer, I just want to hear your answer.
The answer to me is that you have to look at what the acts say are pollutants.
Correct. So
And may I continue?
Okay, right. My
And
guess.
if something the act includes as a pollutant is in the water, you cannot say, in my opinion, that consistent with the law, there are no pollutants in the discharge. But let me go on for just a moment. That is only the beginning of the story. The major part of the story is going to be the next chapter, which is going to be what will the EPA and the state allow in the way of an amended or a modified permit. And if you read the first 75 or so pages of the existing permit, you'll see that it lays out in excruciating detail what pollutants you can include and how much, even though the starting point would be a none, the permit goes beyond that and permits some, subject to reporting limitations in their judgment are correct.
Okay, so my next question is, the Code of Massachusetts regulations and the federal regulations list the levels of pollutants that are items, or constituents that are, when they're at a certain level, are considered pollutants. So for you to say they can't discharge waste is a true statement, but give the rest of the story to the panel.
Are you?
Excuse me, sir.
Surely.
Give the rest of the story to the panel that if these constituents are below the reporting levels that the EPA or the DEP would consider a pollutant, it's like me telling you, you can't own an electric vehicle because there's a potential for that battery to explode and therefore it's really bad for you. It's perfectly legal for you to do it. I just get frustrated when you don't tell the whole story, Mr. Lampert, and that's what you're doing.
Well, are you dealing in particular with the drinking water requirements or what?
Anything.
No,
Anything is limited.
What are the specific limits you're referring to?
Come on, you go to the Code of Regulations
I know,
and you look at all the constituents, and I'm talking about all of
you're
them.
referring. Jack, can you answer the question?
Can I?
Or
Jack,
Seth?
Can I
Jack,
add
go ahead, your turn.
something? Thanks. Okay, microphone's on again. So, and I don't know the answer to this. I'm trying to listen to Mary's question and your presentation. You provided a lot of useful information tonight, and I appreciate having a handout because it is difficult to read this on the wall. I think Mary's question, if you look at drinking water,
Yep.
right, it's not, I'm going to make this up, right? So you have particles of a metal, let's say copper.
Who cares? Take
Right? Pick one, right? So it's not that there can't be 0 particles of copper in the water. There's a limit, right? Let's say it's 10. And the drinking water has to be less than 10 parts of copper, and you can drink it.
Agreed. And where I would take that is, that effectively is what a permit tells you.
Correct.
We're moving above the starting point. Massachusetts' starting point, to me, is the preventive principle. We start with 0. Come talk to us. Let's reason together, and we'll decide how much above 0 for any particular pollutant or contaminant we're willing to let you.
Based on risk.
Based on risk,
So
clearly.
we had this question come up with the radionuclides,
Yep.
right? All the decision-making on effluent concentrations is a risk-based number. And in the settlement agreement, we agreed, the state and Holtec, to have a dose limit that's less than the federal requirements.
At the site.
Inherently,
site.
excuse me?
This was at the site.
Right. So it's inherently safer.
lower
Agreed,
risk.
and I applaud
And-
Seth Schofield for getting that accomplished.
Right, and we've had some discussions back and forth in here with myself and some members of the public about what is that risk value, and we heard today, the gentleman talked about the Beer 7 report, and we get lost in the reports and the numbers, and,
Agreed.
basically people want to know if we had a release or they were successful, what's the consequence of that?
Couldn't agree more.
Right. So the delegation of the state is working with our legislative people to minimize that risk, and it's our preference to not release the water into Cape Cod Bay.
Right,
Right?
and I guess all I would add to that is, well, look what that really is doing, and frankly, what I saw, a lot of what Doctor told us last month, and the presentations 2 months ago.
Jim, microphone?
What I heard the doctor say 2 months ago, and a lot of what I've heard tonight, and frankly, a lot that I've read in the press, is really directed not to what to me is the gating question, which is whether Holtec's current permit allows what they're doing, but to the question that is still to be considered and decided between and among the state, the federal, and obviously Holtec taking part as to what releases will we allow.
Exactly.
But
Right.
we're getting ahead of ourselves
I
when we
just
get
had
into
one
that.
clarification on your presentation. When you talked about dilution water,
Yeah.
when we do the analytical work to calculate a dose or to calculate a concentration, we don't take into account that diluted water. We look at what's the effluent concentration in the tank prior to release.
Which is what I expect you have to do as a practical matter.
Correct.
Because
Because you
obviously, dilution doesn't reduce.
It doesn't reduce the
stuff
amount
that's
of
released,
curies
just the
that are
number of
released.
How long, over
Correct.
what period of time.
That's right.
Dave?
Dave Nichols?
Dave Noyes wants to go first.
I'm
that's
sorry,
fine.
Dave Noyes and then Dave Nichols.
Thank you. Just 2 questions, and I'll try and make them quick.
And I'll try to answer.
Prior to the current permit in 2020, you went through the list of outfalls that
Yep.
were associated with the plant. Were they any different in the prior permit?
The answer is they are different. I can send you a quick summary. I was just trying to shorten this presentation, so I left
Yeah.
out that slide.
Were
of what
they any different with respect to the radiological discharge?
With respect to the radiological discharge, neither permit, since they were EPA, purported to deal with that one way or the other.
So the plant operation since 1972, up to and including its last discharge in 2015, was in violation of the permit?
I don't know that. We had a discussion several months ago about whether there was any spent fuel pool water discharge before you people bought the plant. And there seemed to be some question and some confusion on that. I think what I said at that time, and I still believe it's correct, is if there were spent fuel pool water discharged, that discharge of spent fuel pool water was not authorized by the prior permit, and that's what the EPA told me.
But your discussion on that slide indicated that anything outside of the permitted outfalls would not be an authorized discharge under the permit.
Except of pollutants, which does not include radioactive.
Okay. The other question I had was with respect to the Ocean Sanctuaries Act.
Sure.
So the Code of Massachusetts Regulation 2705 says, the operation and maintenance of approved and licensed discharges from existing municipal, commercial, and industrial facilities, but not any change in or extension of associated structures or uses unless permitted under 301 CMR 2706 are considered to be allowed activities in ocean sanctuaries.
Right.
Is not the operation of the plant approved and licensed existing commercial facility?
There is a serious question of timing there, because the effective date of that was 1971.
There's also a question of whether or not there is going to be, what you are planning to do now is any modification of what's happened
So,
in the
so if it-
past.
so
That,
it's-
if that frankly is an issue that you, the EPA, and the state are going to have to work out.
So the ocean sanctuary's determination or its concerns would be moot if this is not determined to be a new discharge that is not otherwise permitted.
If it is not a new or modified discharge, I believe are the words in the act that kick in a procedure that you have to follow in that case. The other outstanding question there is the date of the license relative to the date of the act. And the date of the act being effective is 1971. Your license to operate, I believe, is 1972. Happenstance.
Jim, if you could put the last slide up before this on the Ocean Sanctuary Act and
Sure.
the Clean Water Act. But the part that I'm confused about, I mean, you mentioned in the green at the bottom that neither excludes any radioactive contaminants. But, and you're taking me down memory lane here, the Atomic Energy Act regulates certain types of radioactive material, not all radioactive material.
Right.
And I'm not sure that the Ocean Sanctuary Act and the Clean Water Act can preempt those materials that are regulated by the NRC. And I'm sure lawyers have argued about that forever. And so if you can give me the short version answer of preemption there, it would be great, instead of the legal brief on it.
What about the settlement agreement?
Well,
now, just these two laws, I'm not talking about.
No, the short answer, probably a number of short answers to that. The first answer to that is, and actually I'll give you a question on it, because I am sure this is an issue that there may be disagreement on, is what is the effect of Holtec's agreement to comply with state law?
Right.
My personal view is that turns this into a fight over, have you violated your contract?
Sure, but the state laws don't regulate materials handled by the Atomic Energy Act, right?
Let me just continue for a moment. The NRC has no regulation that tells you you must ship this water. Holtec has at least 3 other options, all authorized by the NRC. The present status of preemption law, as I understand it, is the NRC does not have sole authority over everything nuclear. And the question of preemption arises if there's a conflict between a state law and a federal law or regulation such that the licensee, here Holtec, cannot comply with both. And my personal view is Holtec can clearly comply with the NRC that gives them options on how to ship without violating any regulation, while at the same time following state law.
But the Ocean Sanctuaries Act and the Clean Water Act don't regulate material regulated by the Atomic Energy Act, right?
Actually, I think because of Holtec's agreement to follow state law, this is not a preemption issue.
Never mind the settlement agreement, just if it was me, the State Clean Water Act and the State Ocean Sanctuary Act don't cover material regulated by the Atomic Energy Act,
I
right?
disagree with that.
Okay, that's fine, and that's all
I disagree with that. My view is that they cover radioactive materials, that at least as the EPA is concerned, there was a practice of EPA not getting into this. As far as I understand it, I don't think the state has gotten into what the scope of those really are yet. And that's going to be a very interesting question for Seth Schofield in the Attorney General's office.
Fair enough.
I would argue it's irrelevant. If you look at, Holtec's dumping, notwithstanding the constituents in it, forget the presence of radioactivity for a minute, it's a discharge of a commercial or an industrial waste.
Yeah, yeah.
So, in the legislature, maybe you want to opine on this. I mean, from a statutory construction point of view, legislature opened up the Ocean Sanctuaries Act in 2018 to allow prospect for expanded municipal discharge in areas otherwise protected. It chose not to open it up to address this. So this is an active consideration, an issue of active concern in the public sphere. Legislature confronted that, said not interested in creating another carve-out, and didn't. So it applies.
All right, Jim.
Yes, sir.
Jim, can you just provide a copy of your presentation to the committee? I mean, via email? A copy of the presentation to the committee.
Sure. To whom,
Okay.
to whom do you want me to send it?
To Pine.
I've probably got, frankly, I've probably got an email list that includes everybody but the kitchen sink.
Yep, absolutely. Just send it to everyone.
Can it be put on the website?
That, we'll see if we can get that done. All right, we got 5 minutes left. It's almost 9 o'clock. How about two public comments? Henrietta, read that letter into the record. Thank you. And then Diane,
Yeah.
in the index.
This is a statement that I was asked to read by Melissa Harding Ferretti, who is the chairlady of the Herring Pond Wampanoag Tribe. And it's titled Statement of the Herring Pond Wampanoag Tribe Opposing Holtec's Proposed Dumping for the 11/28/22 NDCAP meeting. Good evening. For thousands of years, the native people of this region have fished in the waters in and around Cape Cod Bay. To us, the land, water, plants, and wildlife that we coexist with are alive and sacred. We feel a deep responsibility to our tribal youth to ensure that they and their children inherit a planet that has been nurtured, not destroyed. Holtec's proposal to illegally dump over 1 million gallons of radioactive waste into these sacred waters would damage our shellfish, our finned fish, and all the gifts of the sea that give us sustenance. To us, there is no level of radioactive water that can be considered safe. That is why, since the start of this year, we have opposed the dumping. To the Herring Pond Wampanoag, this is a continuation of centuries of colonial domination and expropriation in the heart of our unceded territory. We expressed our protest formally in a letter dated March 15th, 2022. We, the Herring Pond Wampanoag, the original inhabitants of these lands and the original stakeholders, we who live right next to Pilgrim Station, built on our unceded territory, have been rudely overlooked and ignored as if we did not exist. But we do exist. We have existed and will continue to exist. We are still here. Article 32, paragraph 2 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples states that all Indigenous people have a right to good faith consultation and cooperation, quote, prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands, territories, and other resources, particularly in connection with the development, utilization, or exploitation of mineral, water, or other resources, unquote. This includes by any measure of justice the Herring Pond Wampanoag. In fact, it is precisely on the issue of justice that we take issue with a particularly spurious argument from Holtec and their allies. In his June 15th letter to Senator Markey, Holtec CEO Chris Singh proclaimed his company's commitment to environmental justice. He wrote, quote, "The suggestion to ship the water to another location for discharge runs counter to our basic tenets of environmental justice, which has led us to discard the idea," unquote. These words ring hollow in the face of Holtec's apparent intention to dump radioactive wastewater into our ancient and sacred waters. They ring hollow when Holtec fails to acknowledge and consult our Herring Pond community, the first inhabitants and stewards of these lands and waters. Holtec is ignoring the very indigenous voices whose dispossession made the plant possible. How can this possibly be understood as justice? It is not justice, it is colonialism. From our perspective, Singh's words make a mockery of environmental justice. For over 400 years, we have witnessed repeated assaults on our traditional homelands and our environment. When will it stop? Holtec's behavior shows blatant disregard for the rights, needs, and feelings of our indigenous community. It continues to inflict a multi-generational legacy of trauma, abuse, and exploitation. And municipalities throughout Massachusetts have also sent correspondence opposing this action. The dumping of toxic waste into the waters that sustain us could have a grave impact not only on our lifeways, but on all of yours. Once again, we, the first inhabitants of Plymouth, say no to dumping. It is not just, it is not legal, and it must not happen. Kuta putash. Thank you. Signed, Melissa Ferretti, Chairwoman, Herring Pond, Wampanoag Tribe.
Diane Turco with Save Our Bay and Cape Town Winders. I just want to let you know, we've been in touch with Senator Markey's office and the EPA, and just checking in to see what's going on with Holtec. And we understood that there was a slide presentation by Holtec on the water sampling. We were also told that's what would be presented here. So I asked the EPA, so can you help us out with the information? We are not really sure. There was quite a few slides. And this was their response. The water sampling is for information only and is not tied to any regulatory action, including a potentially new or modified NPDES permit. So the whole presentation was a red herring. It has nothing to do with new permit. It has to do with Holtec trying to manipulate information. I want to ask you, Dave, you are applying for a new permit, a new NPDES permit?
That's correct.
Okay. Do you recognize, as EPA has told us, that it would take up to 12 months to issue a new or modified permit?
I don't know what they've told you, no.
I have it in an email. They said it would take up to 12 months. Will Holtec be willing to wait 12 months to dismantle the building?
I don't know. I can't predict now what impact that's going to have on the schedule for decommissioning.
If it takes 12 months, would Holtec honor a new NPDES permit?
Would we honor a new NPDES permit once it was in place?
If it took 12 months?
We would honor the existing NPDES permit.
You're not authorized to release spent fuel pool water with the existing NPDES permit. So now you're applying for a modified or a new permit, and we were told by the EPA it could take up to 12 months to issue that permit. And my question is, will Holtec wait 12 months before they discharge?
I've already said that I can't make that commitment.
Okay. So let me just ask you one more thing. So there's no commitment on going along with the NPDES permit. But Senator Markey sent a letter to Holtec and asked that Holtec publicly commit that it will not discharge any wastewater from the Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station in violation of Holtec's Environmental Protection Agency permit that regulates that activity. I think, how many here think it's illegal? Have we heard enough information? Is it illegal to dump? Okay. All right, so, yes or no? Will Holtec commit to publicly not discharge any wastewater from Pilgrim in violation of Holtec's EPA permit that regulates this activity? That was asked by Senator Markey, and I'd love it if you could make it quick and a yes or a no.
Diane.
I've already answered it. It's the same question I just answered. I don't know how many,
Is it a yes
different
or?
way I can say it.
Okay, a yes or a no then, please, Dave. Just to be clear for us, could we just have a yes or a no?
I think they've made it perfectly
I
clear
don't
where they
know.
stand
It's
for
not
2.5
clear to me.
hours, Diane.
Okay, but John,
We
it's not
understand
clear
that
to
the
me.
January meeting
I
could
understand
have a
that.
significant data presented that night. So
John, I understand. It's just a yes or a no, and then we can move on. I don't understand this answer. It's not it's a no answer. Okay. Is that the response, a no answer? I just want to understand.
he has the right to do whatever he wants to. Okay?
So-
So do you have anything else?
So just to be clear, it's a no answer from Holtec to Senator Markey's question.
I think what you heard tonight was that there's there's a pretty large process that goes on with respect to the state level and the federal level. Mr. Cantwell couldn't have been clearer about the lines of communication being open between the two U.S. senators, your local congressman, and Holtec. So they're working through this process.
I understand that, John, but I don't, did I get an answer? No. No, we didn't get an answer. It's just a yes or a no. And so I don't know why
it's slightly
you're...
more complicated than that.
Well, Senator Markey asked the question, will you commit to publicly following no discharge? I've already read it 3 times. Will you publicly commit to no discharge any wastewater from Pilgrim in violation of your EPA permit that regulates that activity? And so I'm just asking for a yes or a no.
Diane, anything else? Do you have
Okay,
anything
so-
else?
So there's no answer, so I guess that's,
Okay.
I guess that's, yeah, this is all a red herring here. This
Hey,
is all
guys,
a red
this
herring.
is in violation of the open meeting laws. Your comments are disrupting our meeting. Plain and simple. Read it.
All right, there'll be a meeting at the end of January. I think at this stage of the game, we're probably going to keep the same schedule for 23 that we did in 22, which means we're going to meet every 60 days as we continue into the new year. And after we do attendance at the January meeting and we go over the minutes, there'll be an agenda item on electing a new chair and a vice chair, because I've been derelict in putting that on the agenda, so. No, he's all set. Get a motion to adjourn?
I make that motion to adjourn.
Second? Okay, good point. All right, all those in favor of motion to adjourn? All right, the meeting's adjourned. We'll see you late January. Enjoy your holidays. Thank you.